Okay, let's get going. So what I wanted to look at is, there's that story, and it's a bit of a strange story in the Haggadah, where I'll share my screen with you, where the Haggadah tells us about these five people, these five great sages that were sitting. If you remember that in Bnei Brak. So I just want to let's look at this quickly. So the story, that's why I want to try and have a look at that and see what's going on there, because it seems to be there's a bit more stuff to this than meets the eye. So it starts off, we ask the question. So the Manish Tana is a single question with four parts to it. Okay, and if you look in Halakha, it's not so simple, the Manish Tana, because even if you look at the Mishnah, which I'm going to show you now, I think I've got it up still. No. Okay. If you look at the Mishnah says that the way it works is that you pour the second cup of wine. After you've poured the second cup of wine, it says, V'kana ben shoel. This is where the son asks a question. And then it says, and if the son is unable to ask, then the father is patach lo, he opens up the question for the child and says, Manish Tana halayla. So really, what it comes out is that Manish Tana is a question, a series of questions, or one question, however you want to look at it, that is asked, that is a prompt for the kids to ask, as opposed to the essential question. The essential question should be, as you pour the second cup of wine, where they ask, how come we're pouring a second cup of wine? We haven't even had hamotzi yet. That should be the question. Okay, so the question starts, and then we say, because tonight is the night that is different from every other night. Why is tonight a different night from every other night? Because because there was a point in time where we were slaves to Paro, and Hashem took us out of that biyad chazakah, with a strong hand, outstretched arm. And if Hashem had taken us out, then us and our children would have still been slaves to Paro. And that's really the answer. Now, it's not the total answer, and it's not a complete answer, and it's certainly not a comprehensive answer. But it's an answer as to what the night is going to contain within it, different concepts, ideas, strange things that happened. And therefore comes along the Magi. The Magi is the person who wrote the Seder. My kids were told to find out, or asked to find out, let's put it that way, who wrote the Seder. It's not clear who wrote the Seder. It's really 100% not clear. Was it written by one person, three people, over the ages? Things happened. We're not clear. But either way, it says that if we had not been taken out, we still would have been meshubadim, we still have been slaves. Afilu kananu chachamim, and even if we are great chachamim, kulanu levonim, we're incredible tamidei chachamim, kulanu zakanim, and we're old and aged. We've been through the story year after year after year after year. Kulanu yodim es Torah, and we all know Torah. Mitzvah aleinu, there's a mitzvah upon us. Lesaper b'yetziat Mitzrayim. There's a mitzvah to speak about Yetziat Mitzrayim. Lesaper. Now, lesaper means to tell stories about. So the mitzvah of the night is to tell stories about Yetziat Mitzrayim. So that stories are a much more engaging medium than, let's say, just giving away information. So tell stories on the night. Marbeh Lesaper b'yetziat Mitzrayim. The more adds or increases Lesaper, to tell stories about Yetziat Mitzrayim, harei ze meshubach. That is a praiseworthy thing to do. So that's how the Seder starts. That's really the beginning of our Seder. And then the Seder starts telling us the story about these five great sages. And this is what I want to look at some ideas around this. Ma'aseh Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Akiva. There's this Ma'aseh. This thing happened. There's this thing that happens with Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah and Rabbi Akiva. All of them are, and Rabbi Tarfon. They all learn together. But even though they learn together, one of them is their teacher. So they're not all equal, actually, but rather there is a teacher. So Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon are older, and in fact, it seems to be that they're actually in the house of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah is the great sage at that time. He's the patriarch at that time, and so he's actually younger than all of them. So what happens is you have Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yeshua on the one side of him, Rabbi Lazar ben Azariah in the middle, and Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon on the side. So you have, in deference to Rabbi Lazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon, who might be older, kind of like put themselves to the side, and they sit to the one side, and they start learning Torah. That's the part of the story that you all know very well. But however, I want to show you this. That is, and then what happens? They're learning. Vayu masubin b'Bnei Brak. They're in Bnei Brak. You have to understand why they're in Bnei Brak and where Bnei Brak comes from. Vayu masaprim b'Yitziat Mitzrayim kol osai halayla. And they're telling about the stories of Yitziat Mitzrayim kol oto halayla, that whole night. So, what are they telling? I don't know the answer to this, but it's a question we've got to ask ourselves: is what were they talking about? What stories are they telling? And who are they telling each other? How do we know they're telling each other? Because until the Talmidim come and they said lahem, Amru lahem, Rabbeinu, here's man kriyat Shema shachris, time to daven shachris. So we have to understand the story can't be as simple as we want the story to be. But on a certain level of simplicity in the story, the reason we bring the story is to show as an illustration of that we can tell the stories about Yetziat Mitzrayim the whole night, because we don't know everything. They knew everything and they were able to do it the whole night. And why is it so important? The question you have to ask yourself is why do you have to tell me about the Talmidim that came in the morning and they said it's time for Kriyat Shema? What do all these things got to do with each other? And then there's one little spanner in this whole works, and that is the Tosefta. The Tosefta is similar to the Mishnah. It's the work of the Tanaim, but look at this Tosefta. The Tosefta says the following. We know it certainly gives us a halacha, and it teaches us a halacha. And the halacha is ein maftirin achara Pesach afikon, that you can't have after the Korban Pesach, you can't have anything afterwards. Ein maftir. We don't add, we don't eat, we don't do anything in addition to. Kagon, for example, could you eat? Egozim, tamarim, klayot, all different like nuts and dates and roasted wheat, and other sweets, all like lekker dessert stuff, right? So that's number one. That's the first halacha. You have to know when it comes to the Korban Pesach, you can't have anything afterwards. Chayav Adam la'asok b'hilchas Pesach kol halayla. Because it's very different. That a person says the Tosefta is obligated la'asok b'hilchas Pesach, to learn the halachas of Pesach kol halayla. The Tosefta says that a person has to learn, not tell the story, but learn the halachas kol halayla. The whole night. Afilu beino vein beno. Even between him and his son, and if he's on his own, he also has to learn halachas the whole night. And even if he's with his talmidim. So a person has got to learn what? The halachas the whole night, with him and his son, with his children, even if he's on his own, and even if he's with his talmidim. Ma'aseh, now it tells us. There was a Ma'aseh, but Rabban Gamliel was a Canim. There was this matter that happened with Rabban Gamliel and the Zakanim. Now look here. Our says, Maaseh by Rabbi Lesaper, Rabbi Shiur, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Tarfon. Who's missing? Rabban Gamliel. It seems to be a different Maaseh. That was Shayu Masumba by Baitus, Ben Zunin. They were with Ben Baitus, Ben Zunim in Lud. In Lud, not in Bnei Brak. Vayu Asukim b'Hilchos Pesach, and they were learning halachas of Pesach. Kol halayla, until the whole night. Ad krot hagever, until they heard the rooster crow. V'higiu milifneim v'noadu v'halchu lebeis hamedrash. They heard the rooster crows. The students v'higiu milifneim. What happens is they v'higiu, that the students lifted up the window so that they could see the sun, and the sun could stream in from them. And they said, okay, we better stop. They went to go learn. So now those stories, whilst very, very similar, are very, very different. So let's try and get a little bit of understanding of what is going on in the story and what is going on in halakha, and let's see what's going on. So firstly, these five chevra, Rabbi Elazar ben Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Tarfon, they're sitting in Bnei Brak and they're learning the whole night. What are they learning? Hayu masaprim B'Yetzias Mitzrayim Kol Halayla. They're telling the stories of Yetzias Mitzrayim. Look at this. Comes along the Rambam in Hilchos Chametz U'Matzah, and the Rambam says, he says, by the way, don't forget, there's a statement of Rabban Gamliel. Rabban Gamliel is the guy from the Tosefta. That's the second story. He said you got to say 3 things in your home, and if you haven't said those, then what? Then you have not fulfilled your mitzvah of the night. And what are those things? We know Pesach, Matzah, and Maror. And there's a reason for each one of them. Pesach and Matzah and Maror. But those reasons, by the way, those reasons are stories. The reason for Pesach is because HaKadosh Baruch Hu was Pesach. He jumped over all the houses of the Jewish people. That's the whole story. There's a whole entire narrative that one has that can go with that whole story that we have to bear in mind, and we've got to tell over. What about Maror? Maror is because the Egyptians embittered the lives of our forefathers. That's a whole story in itself as well. So, what about Matzah? Because we were redeemed. So, comes along Rabban Gamliel, and Rabban Gamliel, who had said, who was sitting in the house with all these chevra, and they were learning the halachas the whole night of Pesach, at least according to the way the Tosefta presents it. Rabban Gamliel says, you know what? It's not only about halachas. It's not only about halachas. The halachas are only. Sorry, say that again.
Let me ask you a question. You know when you go back in the beginning, right? For the matzah.
Yes.
So why so late? You have the meal. You go through the seder.
Yes.
And why so late? You have to bench. Don't you have to bench in 72 minutes?
72 minutes from when? From the meal.
Yeah.
Yeah, but one does. Oh, I see. You're saying from the time that you ate the matzah.
Yeah.
No, because your meal is from the time that the meal ends, the 72 minutes ends from the time you stop eating. Not bread, the time you stop eating, because all the food is mitzvah. It all comes together as part of the meal. Okay, does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Because if they didn't do that, boy, we'd be in such trouble. Oaks would be benching left, right, and center. They wouldn't know what was going on. Can you imagine? They have to bench and then wash again to eat the chicken soup, and wash again to eat the chicken, and wash again to eat the meat. And then, of course, there's the dessert. And, actually, somebody goes fish, the egg. I mean, it's a whole disaster. So I think Chazal would cant. That's it from the end of the meal. Okay. So you're with me here. So it comes along, it's a good question, but it is a good question, by the way. But comes along, and then it says, Udvarim ha'elu kulan nikra'in haggadah. These things, dafka, these things, says the Rambam, are called the concept of haggadah. Yes, are called the concept of haggadah. Okay? If that's the case, then what is Rabban Gamliel telling us in this part of the Tosefta, where he says that they were sitting there and they were learning Oske Behilchos HaPesach Kol Halayla? Is there a difference in learning the halachas of Pesach, and there's a difference in telling the story of Pesach? What do you think? Because the way the Haggadah presents us is that there's a mitzvah lesaper b'Yetzias Mitzrayim, telling us about the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim, not about the halacha of Pesach, but about the stories of Yetzias Mitzrayim. To carry that further, oh gosh, my battery's running. Give me 1 second, guys. So what I'm saying is, to carry it even further, if you look into the Shulchan Aruch puts the two together. And the Shulchan Aruch, and if you hadn't learned that Tosefta, you wouldn't know where it comes from. Because the Shulchan Aruch says, Chayav Adam la'asok b'hilchos HaPesach, that a person has an obligation la'asok, to involve himself in the laws of Pesach, uve Yetzias Mitzrayim, and the story of the Exodus, ulesaper, and to tell in a story form benisim, niflaot, and all the miracles and the wonders, she'asa HaKadosh Baruch Hu l'avotenu ad shetit chatfenu sheina, until sleep overcomes him. Sure. So if that's the case, we can see that these two stories come together. That on the one hand, a person has to tell the halachas, and on the other hand, a person has to tell the story. If that's the case, so out of this we can learn a very important thing, and that is that the night is not a night that is single dimensional. It's not one dimensional. It's multidimensional. Why is it multidimensional? Because some people you need to tell the halachas of because that's what turns them on. Other people need to tell the stories because that's what turns them on. And the night really is a night of people being turned on in a different way. We have these four incredible people these five incredible people in Bnei Brak that are telling the Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim because they're speaking in an esoteric sense, whereas the ones in Rabban Gamliel, they're talking about the halacha. And in fact, that's why it moves from that story into the Arba Banim, into the four sons, because the four sons are the example of the different styles that are required when we educate our children. What I want to add and show you is something really, what I think is pretty cool. I don't know, can you see? Did it change the screen? Can you now see the Marbeh Lesaper here on the right, or not?
Yeah, I can see it.
Say again?
Yeah, I can see.
Okay, you can see it. Okay, so I want to show you this Marbeh Lesaper. I'm going to try and actually open him up because then it'll be easier to see. We'll close this one. Okay. So now look at this. He says the following, and this is really geschmack because we need to try and understand this. So it comes along. He says, considering that Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Tam from old and wise, that's what we said, we explained where they were sitting and the way they were sitting. But he says the sages gathered in Bnei Brak. Why was it called Bnei Brak? Why is it called Bnei Brak? So called because they were in the home of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, who was the patriarch at the time, and whose dishes and whose utensils sparkled like lightning. It's Bnei Brak. It's a place in which your dishes and utensils sparkle. What do I care if your dishes and utensils are sparkling? Why is that so important for me to know on the night of the Seder that they're sitting in a place where the oak kept his house clean? Right? But don't your dishes and utensils sparkle? That's because of beauty, right? Okay, or Lizzie, whoever it is, right? Not going to, right? It's not the house of Elazar ben Azariah. So I think part of this is that the reason why they're sparkling is that reality is in those days they didn't have sunlight liquid, but for Pesach, they scrubbed and they cleaned and they made sure that things were sparkling out of the honor of the Chag. Out of the honor of the Chag, not because of being Pesachdik, but out of the honor of the Chag, everything's sparkling. So they're sitting in this place and we're learning a lesson. Even the greatest sage of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, you would think has got better things to do than clean his dishes. But even in his house, the dishes are sparkling. Everything's beautiful. It's set out beautifully for the honor of the Chag. Okay, so he says here, the Marbeh Lesaper, the story is brought as a proof for the previous statement, even though all experts in 4 levels of Torah study, they still spend the entire night recalling the recounting the story of the Exodus. In the Zohar, we learn that when we tell the story of the Exodus, listen to this, Hashem sends his angels to listen to his children telling their story. What do you mean? What do you mean to his children telling their story? The angels listen to his children telling their story. Where's the story of the angels in the story of Pesach? Where's the angels? We say Dafka, there was Hashem who did everything. It wasn't the angels. So where's the story of the angels? Because even though we say Hashem did it all on his own, if we look into the Midrashim and we start telling the stories the way the Chazal understood the stories, we see that at every single point there are Malachim there that are protecting Bnei Israel. They're doing different things. The Malachim were at the Red Sea, the Malachim were at Har Sinai, the Malachim are everywhere. And they get excited by the fact that their story is also being told. Why are they there the whole night? Now this is beautiful. He says the following. The word night, Lila, is masculine here. here, where it says that they told the story of the night, because it says, Kol halayla. Look at this. In the way that it presents the story, it says that they were Mesubin, are you Mesamri? Kol oto halayla. Oto is a masculine form. So they were there saying it in the masculine form that night. So comes along the Marbeh Lesaper and he says, you have to understand that the night is made up of two parts. From evening until midnight is one part of the night, and then from midnight to the morning is another part of the night. So the first one is called Lail, which is the feminine form, and the second part is called Laila, which is the evening form. The entire night, he says, means that it's not the first part, because the masculine part is the second form. Why is that? Because the first part of the night, okay, is a time where we require what we call rachamim. It's a time for us, we need the rachamim, therefore we refer to the night in the feminine form, because in actual fact, it's a time of din. As things get darker and darker and darker, it's a time of judgment. So therefore we need to call the night, we try to do it the opposite way, we call it feminine, right? So the first night is feminine. The second part of the night is the masculine. It's possible that each of the sages spent the first part of the night in his own home, doing the Seder for the members of his household after midnight. Everything comes together, all of them, to sing songs, to say Shir Hashirim together, to do everything that they could until sleep overtook them. That's what the ideal was. But you know what happened? They were so enthralled and they're so excited and they're so into telling the story that they stay up the whole night until the students come and say to them, our rabbis, it's time to say the morning Shema. So he asked the obvious question, the Marbeh Lesaper said, what, it's not like they had like blockout curtains in those days. And surely you can see some light. There's always light. He says they surely saw the sun was rising. Surely the discussion interpretation were not all so encompassing they didn't notice what the time was. No one's that engrossed. The fact is, he says, they were in Bnei Brak. And the light of their discussion was brilliant. They could not differentiate between day and night. Why Bnei Brak? So he says, the word Brak, as we said earlier on, means lightening and brightness. Okay? So really what he's saying is that the light of their conversation was so powerful that it filled everything. They didn't even realize that it was light outside. Where do you have a similar reference, guys? The end of last week's parsha. At the end of last week's parsha, the Torah describes Moshe Rabbeinu having these karan or, these like rays of light coming out of his head, because he was so connected, he was so engrossed, he was so involved in Torah that the light shone from him. So too, they have this light that is shining, and the light of their discussion was so brilliant they couldn't differentiate. Or you could say, listen to this one, possibly a fire came from heaven and surrounded them so they couldn't see that the daytime had arrived. What are you talking about? Why would a fire come down from heaven? So why would a fire come down from heaven is based on Pirkei Avot. Pirkei Avot tells us that when you sit on your own, Hashem is present and you're learning Torah. When you sit on, not when you're like working. When you sit on your own and you're learning Torah, Hashem is present. When you're doing 2 people, Hashem is present. When you're with 5 people, Hashem is present. All different in different ways. Hashem is present there. But can you imagine the 5 greatest sages of the generation are sitting around? Can you imagine the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu around them? So he says that's the fire. And therefore the disciples come and they said to them, one should not mix up commandments with one another. You have to be careful, say their students. You taught us that mitzvahs have a specific time. You taught us when it's time to do a mitzvah that is for that time, that you can't do it any other time. You've got to do it now and then. You guys are busy involved. I don't think I call them guys. You, our rabbis, our heroes, our rabbeim, right? You are busy involved in a certain mitzvah, but in actual fact, it's daytime now. That mitzvah is over. And the obligation now is no longer the obligation to tell the story, but rather it's the obligation to mention the Exodus when you say the final passage of the Shema. Now, that's an unbelievable thing. They were involved in the telling of the story, and according to the Marbeh Lesaper, what would the students come and tell them to do? Tell them to say the Shema. Why? Because you just have to mention the words. Because what we learn from this is such a powerful thing, I think. Sometimes we get our mitzvahs like mixed up. There's a time and a place for every mitzvah. And the mitzvah to tell the story of Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim comes when? On the night of the 14th or the 15th. The night of the 15th of Nisan. That's the time to tell the story. Any other time is not the time to tell the story from a mitzvah point of view. You want to inspire people, whatever, gesundheit. But the mitzvah at any other time is what? Is just to mention the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim, which is what we say in the last paragraph of the Shema. Something so important, sometimes we get caught up in a certain mitzvah without getting caught up in everything, in the stuff that we're supposed to. And then he gives another explanation. And I think this is a very nice, interesting explanation. He says the following. The reason the students came to remind their teachers about the Shema was to emphasize two aspects, as we said, right, of the story of the Exodus. One is the telling of the story, okay, of the actual Yetziat Mitzrayim, and the other one is what? The second is the story of the splitting of the Red Sea, and because there are two distinct stories. The story of the Exodus is the beginning part of the coming out of Mitzrayim. It ends when they leave. That's the end of it. That's chapter 1. Now close that chapter. The next chapter is the splitting of the sea. And in fact, he says, and this is such an important thing, is that the splitting of the sea as part of the Shachrit service is actually a mitzvah from the Torah. Look at this. He says here, the disciples came to remind their teachers the situation which recalled half of the Exodus, the splitting of the sea as part of the Shachrit service. According to Rav Yehuda, the recitation of the Shema is ordained by the sages, but the mention of the splitting of the sea is a Torah obligation. Where do you see the Torah obligation of the splitting of the sea? So I'm going to show you this in the Siddur. Anyone want to venture a guess? Where do we fulfill a Torah obligation on a daily basis regarding the splitting of the sea?
Just before Yeshtabach.
You mean the saying of that story? Yes. So now what happens is that, let's say you're late for davening. Doesn't happen to any of us. You're late for davening, okay? And if you're late for davening, there's certain things you can leave out, which one of them includes the Shirat Hayam, the story of the sea. But if you've got a Torah obligation, how can you exclude? How can you leave it out? Because it's not only there. That is not the essence. That's the praise of Hashem. But the mention, the actual mention of the obligation of what's it called, of Yetziat Mitzrayim, of the splitting of the sea, comes in. I'm just going to show you the one in Shachrit. In Shachrit, it says the following at the end: Ezrat Avotenu. You've said the brachas. You've said Shema. You're about to go into the Amidah, and look what it says: Mi Mitzrayim galtanu Hashem Elokeinu. Hashem, you took us out of Mitzrayim. Mi Beit Avadim Piritanu, and you redeemed us from the house of slavery. Kol b'chorei hemarakta. You killed all the b'chorim. You killed all their firstborns. V'chor chagalta, but you redeemed your firstborn. V'yam suf bakata, and you split the sea. V'zaydim tibata, v'didim e'avarta. The Zaydim are the Egyptians. It's just a horrible word. It's a very disparaging word against them. You drowned them, v'didim e'avarta, and those you loved, you crossed over. And the waters covered them and no one was left over. When you say that, says Rav Yehuda, you have fulfilled a mitzvah d'oraisa, a Torah obligation to mention the splitting of the sea every single day, which I think is pretty cool. And if that's the case, says the Marbeh Lesaper, it's incumbent upon the students to remind their teacher of this, because they were so engrossed in the discussion of the Exodus, they would have forgotten that there's another mitzvah, and that's the mitzvah of mentioning the Kriyat Yamsuf. And then he goes on, as we'll finish. He says, why does the Haggadah include a story about the 5 sages? Dafka these guys. So the sages disagreed over the issue and what part of the night one is obligated to recall and discuss the Exodus. According to Rabbi Lazar and Rabbi Lazim and Azariah, you got to do it until midnight. That's one of the things that we say in the Seder. That we say, we speak about that all night and all day, it's all different things. Where do we have to until midnight? His opinion is based on the idea that Exodus took place at midnight. Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yeshua say the Exodus should be discussed all night long, since the time of the flight from Egypt took place the following day. Therefore, we should continue to discuss the story until the hour of the flight. Rabbi Tarfon was also involved in this agreement. His argument went on all night as to whether we should tell the story of the Exodus until midnight or until daybreak. So interestingly, is that their thing is, what their discussion was? Their discussion in telling about the Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim wasn't about telling the Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim, is telling the Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim in order to determine whether or not you should tell it the whole night. So who won that argument? Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yeshua. It's an unbelievable thing. Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yeshua, who are the who Rabbi Akiva is Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Yeshua is his teacher. They are the senior people in that place. They win the argument. We never hear about that they win an argument according to the way the Marbeh Lesaper presents that it was an argument, but we don't know that it's an argument. We only know that what do? We try and endeavor to stay up as long as we possibly can through midnight. I think last year was the first time in history where people didn't compare the time they finished their seders to one another. Because it was a time we all locked up. So it didn't really make a difference what time you finished. There was no one to see, right? But according to Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yeshua, it would seem that one should go as presented by the Marbeh Lesaper into the second part of the night, into the masculine part of the night, into that part of the night that is demanding of so much gevura, so much strength, because you're moving from the darkness into the light, and you have to persist and keep going until daybreak. And that's really what it's all about, is persisting and going from the nighttime of Galut into the daybreak of Geula, of redemption. I hope that gave you a bit of a kind of context and structure to those little stories. And please God, next week we'll do one more before next week and the week after. So we've got two more. Please God, to be able to go a little bit deeper into the Seder, guys.
Shkach, Rav.